My grandmother died without her necklace. Someone in my own family took it from her bedroom the night before her funeral and sold it for cash. I was 11 years old when I found out. I told myself I would find it. 23 years later, I did. And nobody, not even a billionaire with unlimited money, was going to take it from my family again.
Broke girl stuns room, wins $9 million necklace from billionaire. Nobody in that room knew who she was. They were about to find out. The gavel was still in the air. The auctioneer's voice had climbed 3 octaves in 30 seconds. Around the room, men in tailored suits and women draped in borrowed confidence sat rigid, paddles frozen at their sides. Because something had just happened that none of them could explain. A woman in a plain navy dress, no jewelry, no entourage, no name tag that meant anything to anyone in that building, had just placed a bid that made a billionaire put his paddle down. $9 million. The room didn't applaud. It didn't gasp. It went completely, utterly silent. The kind of silence that only happens when an entire room full of powerful people suddenly realizes they are not the most interesting person in it. Her name was Caroline Merritt, and if you had passed her on the street that morning, you would not have looked twice. She had taken the subway to get to the auction house. Not a cab, not a car service, the subway, with a secondhand leather tote bag on her shoulder and a crease in her dress she had tried to iron out twice before leaving her apartment in Queens. She was 34 years old, worked as a hospital administrator at a mid-sized medical center in Brooklyn, and made a salary that, by New York standards, kept her comfortable, but never easy. She did not collect art. She did not attend galas. She had never in her life walked into a Christie's auction, and she had certainly never held a bidding paddle. But on the morning of March 14th, she walked through those glass doors on Rockefeller Plaza, signed in under her own name, took her seat in the back row, and waited. She had been waiting, in one way or another, for over 20 years. To understand what happened in that auction room, you have to go back. Not just a few years, not just to some financial crisis or personal setback, but all the way back to a small town in rural Mississippi where a girl named Dorothy Mae Collins was born in the summer of 1928, the third child of a sharecropping family who worked land they did not own, in a county where the rules about what a black family could have and keep and pass down were written not in law alone, but in the daily texture of everything around them. Dorothy grew up in a house with no running water until she was 9 years old. She learned to read from her mother by lamplight because the school available to her ran only 4 months of the year, and the teacher had 40 children in a single room and did what she could with what she had. Dorothy was not a child who complained about the conditions of her life. She was a child who paid attention to them. She watched how her mother moved through hardship with a specific quality of grace that was not resignation and not defeat, but something closer to a decision, a quiet daily decision, to be more than the circumstances around her required her to be. By the time Dorothy was 17, she had already developed the reputation in her community for being the person you called when something needed doing with care. She sewed, she cooked, she could stretch a small amount of food into a meal that made people feel full in a way that had nothing to do with quantity. She had a way with words that was precise, without being cold, and warm, without being soft. People trusted her with things they didn't tell anyone else. Her own mother used to say that Dorothy had been born already understanding something about people that most folks spent their whole lives trying to figure out. At 19, she made a decision that changed the direction of her life. She packed a single bag, said goodbye to her parents at the door of a house that had no running water and too many children and not enough of anything, and took a bus to Birmingham, Alabama, where a cousin had told her there was work available for a woman who knew how to run a kitchen and keep a household in order. She arrived in Birmingham in the spring of 1948 with $11, a change of clothes, and the particular combination of fear and certainty that belongs to people who know they are exactly where they are supposed to be, even when they have no way to prove it yet. Birmingham in 1948 was a city of enormous and visible contradictions. It was industrious and prosperous in the way that American cities were prosperous in the years after the war, full of construction and commerce, and the particular energy of a place that believes it is going somewhere. It was also one of the most aggressively segregated cities in the American South, a place where the distance between the world available to a white woman and the world available to a black woman of identical ability and character was not measured in inches, but in entire dimensions of possibility. Dorothy understood the city she had come to. She had not come because she believed it would be easy. She had come because she believed that within the constraints of what was available to her, there was still enough room to build something that mattered. That belief, that specific and stubborn and completely unromantic belief, was the thing that would define her for the next 50 years of her life. She had a necklace, a gold chain with a central pendant of white diamonds arranged around a single deep blue Ceylon sapphire, flanked by two smaller rubies set in an antique rose gold frame. It was not costume jewelry. Anyone with any eye for fine things could see that within 10 seconds of looking at it. Dorothy wore it only twice a year, on Easter Sunday and on New Year's Eve. And when she wore it the way a person carries something sacred, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of its weight. The children would ask her where it came from. She would smile and say it was a gift. When they pushed further, she would say it was a gift from someone who understood that some things in this world are worth more than their price. She never said more than that. Not to her children, not to her grandchildren, and not even to Caroline, who was her youngest grandchild and, by everyone's admission, her closest. Caroline was 8 years old the last time she saw the necklace on her grandmother's neck. It was Easter Sunday, 1998. Dorothy had made her famous sweet potato pie, the house smelled like brown sugar and clove, and the whole Merritt family had crowded into the small living room after church. Caroline remembered sitting at Dorothy's feet and staring up at the necklace while Dorothy read to her from a picture book about a girl who lived near the sea. She remembered reaching up and touching the sapphire with one finger, and Dorothy looking down at her and saying, very quietly, that it was hers one day. That it had always been hers. Caroline was 8. She didn't know what that meant. She tucked it away the way children tuck things away, somewhere soft and internal, and forgot about it until the year everything changed. Dorothy Merritt died in the spring of 2001. She was 73 years old, and she went the way she had lived, quietly, without fuss, in her own bed with her Bible on the nightstand. What she left behind was a house with a leaking roof, a small savings account with less than $4,000 in it, and 6 children who each believed, in some small corner of their hearts, that they were her favorite. The family gathered for the funeral, and then, as families do, they gathered for the harder conversation, the division of what little there was. It was supposed to be straightforward. It was not. Because when Caroline's mother, Ruth, went to find the necklace in the small wooden box where Dorothy always kept it, the box was empty, and no one in the family could agree on where it had gone. The accusations were quiet at first, a look held too long across the dinner table, a comment made under the breath, then louder, then bitter. Caroline's Uncle Raymond, the eldest, insisted he had never touched it. Her Aunt Sylvia said she had seen someone going through Dorothy's bedroom the night before the funeral, but couldn't say who. For 2 years, the Merritt family fractured slowly over a missing piece of jewelry that most of them had only ever seen on 2 days of the year. Caroline watched her mother cry at the kitchen sink more times than she could count, and somewhere in the grief and the anger and the confusion, she made herself a quiet promise. She was 11 years old. She would find it. It took her 23 years, and the path was not straight. There were years in between where Caroline set the promise aside because life required it. College at Howard University on a partial scholarship and 3 part-time jobs. Then graduate school for healthcare administration at Columbia. Then entry-level work. Then mid-level work. Then a career that finally gave her enough stability to breathe. She dated. She moved apartments 4 times. She watched her mother's health decline and then stabilize and then decline again. She was not a woman on a single-minded obsession. She was a person living her life. But the necklace lived somewhere underneath all of it, like a splinter that never fully worked its way out. Every few years, something would bring it back. A family gathering where the old wound reopened. A conversation with her mother on a slow Sunday afternoon. A dream she had at least a dozen times over the years. Always the same. Dorothy at the kitchen table under the single bulb, the necklace catching the light. What those 23 years cost Caroline personally is something she has spoken about only in fragments, in the spaces between other answers in interviews, in the pauses that careful listeners noticed and most journalists did not follow. She was in her mid-20s when she first tried to formally investigate the disappearance, a brief period during a summer between graduate school semesters, when she had written letters to 3 auction houses in the Atlanta area, asking if they had records of a specific lot. None of them responded. She had filed that attempt away and returned to the demands of her degree and told herself she would try again when she had more time and more tools. She was 29 when she tried a second time, spending 3 weekends combing through online estate sale archives and getting nowhere specific enough to act on. She was 31 when she found a jewelry appraisal community online and lurked in it for 2 years, learning the language of provenance and lot documentation and estate transfer, building knowledge she didn't yet have a use for, but suspected she eventually would. She was not in a hurry. She had made a promise. Promises don't expire. The personal cost showed up in quieter ways. Friends who didn't understand why she kept returning to a story that had no resolution. Relationships where she sometimes felt the necklace sitting between her and another person, like an object on a table that neither of them could name, but both of them could feel. A therapist she saw in her late 20s, who asked her once whether she thought the search for the necklace had become a way of staying connected to her grandmother after the grief of losing her, and who she told firmly that it was not grief management, it was a promise, and who she stopped seeing shortly after because she felt the question, however well-intentioned, had missed the point entirely. She was not searching because she could not let go. She was searching because she had made a commitment, and she was not the kind of person who unmade commitments simply because they were difficult. That distinction mattered to her. It still matters to her. It is, in many ways, the most important thing to understand about who Caroline Merritt is. The break came in the summer of 2023, and it came from the most ordinary place imaginable. Caroline was scrolling through an estate jewelry forum online, something she did occasionally with the detached curiosity of someone who isn't really looking for anything specific, when she came across a thread discussing a lot that had passed through a small auction house in Atlanta in 2003. The description made her stop scrolling. Gold chain, central sapphire pendant, rose gold frame, 2 flanking rubies, antique setting consistent with mid-century American craftsmanship. She read the description 3 times. Then she screenshot it, put her phone face down on the table, stood up, walked to her window, and stood there for a long time looking out at the street below, because the dates lined up. 2 years after Dorothy's death. 2 years after the box was found empty. Someone had sold it in Atlanta in 2003. What followed was 8 months of work that Caroline did almost entirely on her own, in the hours before and after her full-time job, with the methodical patience of someone who had learned not to rush hope. She tracked the 2003 Atlanta sale to a small regional auction house that had since closed. She contacted former employees through LinkedIn and got 2 responses. One of them remembered the lot and confirmed it had sold to a private buyer. Getting the name of that buyer took 4 more months, a formal records request, a lawyer's letter, and a favor from a contact at a probate court in Georgia who owed her a professional courtesy. The buyer had been a collector named Howard Ellison, a retired textile businessman from Savannah, who had since passed away in 2019. His estate had been liquidated in parts, and in December 2023, Caroline found the necklace again, listed as part of a premium jewelry lot being prepared for a major auction at Christie's, New York, scheduled for the following March. The full story of that 8-month investigation is one that Caroline has described as the most intellectually demanding thing she has ever done. More demanding in its way than graduate school, more demanding than the most complex administrative challenges of her professional career. Because it was not just a research project. It was a research project being conducted at the outer edge of her emotional endurance, in the hours stolen from a full-time job and a life that had its own constant demands, with no guarantee at any point that it would lead anywhere at all. The first 2 months were almost entirely dead ends. The Atlanta auction house had closed in 2011. Its physical records had been partially digitized and partially lost. The former employees she tracked down on LinkedIn responded at a rate of about 1 in 4, and most of those responses were polite variations of the same message. I am sorry, I don't remember that specific lot. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected angle. A woman named Brenda Okafor had worked as a cataloger at the Atlanta auction house from 2001 to 2006 and had left to start her own antique appraisal business in Decatur. She had not responded to Caroline's initial LinkedIn message. She responded 6 weeks later, after seeing a post in a private online group for antique jewelry enthusiasts, where Caroline had described the necklace in detail and asked if anyone had any knowledge of its provenance history. Brenda had been a member of that group for years and connected it, after some reflection, to a lot she remembered from her cataloging days, because it had been unusual enough to stick in her memory. She remembered it because the consignor had been nervous. She remembered it because the item had been brought in without documentation, and the consignor had been anxious to complete the transaction quickly. She messaged Caroline privately and said she thought she remembered this piece and asked if Caroline could call her. That phone call with Brenda lasted 3 hours and changed the entire direction of the investigation. Brenda confirmed the lot description, the approximate date, and that her records from that period included the consignor's name and contact information. She was not legally obligated to share that information. She shared it anyway, because she said she had been doing this work long enough to know when something belonged to someone and when it didn't. She said some things carry their owners with them. You can feel it when you handle them. That piece always felt like it was waiting to go somewhere. Caroline drove to Decatur the following weekend, sat in Brenda's appraisal shop for 4 hours, and when she left, she had the consignor's name written on a piece of paper in her tote bag. She drove to a parking lot 2 blocks away, sat in her rental car, and said her uncle's name out loud once, to no one. Then she started the engine and drove back to the airport. She had 90 days before the auction, and she had, in her savings account at that moment, $42,000. She did not tell anyone what she was planning. Not her mother, not her best friend Tamara, not her coworker David, who sometimes covered for her when she needed time off. She told no one, because she did not want to explain something she couldn't fully explain herself. She only knew that the necklace was coming back to New York. She only knew that she had made a promise at 11 years old. And she only knew, with the kind of certainty that bypasses logic entirely, that she was going to be in that room when the gavel came down. The money was the harder problem. The pre-sale estimate was between $6 and $8 million. Caroline had $42,000. The number was so far from what she needed that it could have ended the whole thing before it started. But here is what Caroline Merritt understood, from years of navigating systems that were not built for people like her, that a number is not a wall. It is a starting point for a conversation. She approached 3 private lenders. 2 turned her down within a week. The third, a boutique art financing firm in Midtown, agreed to a meeting. She walked in with her documentation, her photographs, her jewelry historian's letter, and a repayment plan she had built out to the last decimal point. She sat across from a man named Gerald Park, and she spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She told him about Dorothy. She told him about the promise. She told him about 23 years. Gerald Park, who had worked in art finance for over 2 decades, and described himself as someone who did not make decisions based on sentiment, approved a secured loan of up to $10 million. He told her later that she was the most prepared client he had seen walk through his door in 5 years. What Gerald Park did not know, and what Caroline has only spoken about in private, was how close she came to not making that appointment at all. The night before she was scheduled to meet him, she had sat at her kitchen table in Queens for 2 hours, staring at the documentation she had assembled, the 11 photographs of Dorothy wearing the necklace, the jewelry historian's letter, the probate records, the death certificate, the repayment schedule she had built across 40 pages of a spreadsheet she had been quietly constructing for 3 months, and she had felt, for the first time since she was 11 years old, genuinely afraid that she was about to be told no in a room where the no would be final. She had called Tamara that night, which was the first time she had told anyone anything about what she was doing. She had not told Tamara all of it. She had said she had a big meeting the next morning about something personal and important, and she needed someone to tell her she wasn't crazy for trying. Tamara had said she had never once in their 20 years of friendship thought Caroline Merritt was crazy for anything she tried. She had said, "Go to that meeting and say every word you know how to say." Caroline had gone to sleep at midnight and woken at 4:30 and ironed her interview clothes and gone. The morning of the auction, Caroline woke up at 5:30. She ironed her navy dress twice. She took the subway. She signed in at the front desk and took her seat in the 4th row from the back, placed her tote bag under her seat, and read through her documentation one more time. Not because she needed to, but because it settled her. Around her, the room filled with exactly the kind of people you would expect at a Christie's auction on a Tuesday morning in March. Collectors, dealers, hedge fund managers whose assistants had done the research. A man in the front row whose name she recognized from the Forbes list. A real estate and energy billionaire named Marcus Webb, who had reportedly been interested in the lot for months. Marcus Webb was 58 years old, silver-haired, and moved through rooms the way people move through rooms when they have never once in their adult life had to wait for anything. His opening bid, when the lot came up, was $4 million. The room exhaled. 4 million was a message. It was the sound of a door closing before anyone else had fully stepped through it. Caroline let 3 more bids pass. Webb at 4 million. A phone bidder at 4.8. A woman in a yellow jacket at 5.2. Webb again at 5.9. Then Caroline raised her paddle. 6.1 million. Webb responded almost immediately. 6.5. Caroline, 7 million. The woman in the yellow jacket dropped out. The phone bidder came back at 7.4. Webb at 7.9. Caroline, 8.3. The phone bidder went quiet. The room was no longer settling between bids. People had turned in their seats. Someone behind Caroline whispered something she didn't catch. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. Webb bid 8.7. His jaw had tightened. He was not a man who lost things. Caroline took one breath, looked down at the photograph of Dorothy in her hand. The Easter Sunday picture from 1998. Dorothy in her good dress with the necklace at her throat, and her face full of the particular piece of someone who has nothing left to prove. And she raised her paddle one final time. $9 million. The room went still. The auctioneer looked at Webb. Webb looked at Caroline. For 4 seconds, nothing moved. Then Marcus Webb set his paddle on his knee and did not pick it up again. The gavel came down. The sound of it was the loudest thing Caroline Merritt had ever heard in her life. She did not cry until she was outside. She stood on the sidewalk on Rockefeller Plaza, the March wind cutting through her navy dress, the tote bag on her shoulder, and she let it happen quietly, the way her grandmother had done most things, without fuss, without performance. A Christie's representative came out to confirm the paperwork and offered her a car. She declined. She called her mother from the sidewalk and said, in a voice that her mother described later as the steadiest she had ever heard from her daughter, that she had found it and that she was bringing it home. Ruth Merritt, who was 71 years old and had spent over 2 decades carrying the grief of that empty wooden box, did not say anything for a long time. And then she said that Dorothy had always known. But the story does not end at the auction. Because the truth about who took the necklace in the first place was about to surface after more than 20 years of silence, and the name at the center of it was one Caroline already knew. The name in the consignment record from the 2003 Atlanta auction was Leonard Merritt, Caroline's uncle Leonard, Dorothy's 4th child. A man who had, by 2001, accumulated enough financial pressure from a failed construction business and 2 outstanding personal loans that the math of his desperation had apparently, at some point in the 2 days surrounding his mother's funeral, become stronger than every other thing in him. Caroline had suspected Leonard for years without ever being able to prove it. The family had suspected him too, in the unspoken way that families carry their suspicions, wrapped in the tissue paper of keeping the peace and not saying the thing that cannot be unsaid. Leonard had died in 2017 from complications related to diabetes. He had died without ever admitting it, without ever saying to Ruth, or to any of his siblings, or to Caroline, what he had done and why, and whether it had haunted him the way it had haunted everyone else. Caroline found out the truth in October 2023, 5 months before the auction. She sat with that information for 3 days before she told anyone. And the person she told first was not her mother. It was Leonard's daughter, her cousin Denise, who was 40 years old and lived in Atlanta, and had spent her whole adult life in the shadow of her father's reputation, within the family, without ever fully understanding what had caused the fracture. Caroline called Denise on a Sunday afternoon and told her everything. Denise was quiet for a long time. Then she said she had always known it was him. She said she was 17 when Dorothy died. She was in that house the night before the funeral. She saw her father go into Dorothy's bedroom alone. She told herself he was just grieving. She told herself she was imagining something that wasn't there. But she was 17, and she knew her father, and she knew what money trouble looked like in their house, and she told herself a story that let her go to sleep that night, and she had been telling herself that story for 22 years. Then she said she was sorry. She said she was 17, and she was scared, and she was sorry. Caroline told her she had been a child. She told her she had not done anything wrong. Denise flew to New York for the auction. She had not told Caroline she was coming. She simply appeared in the lobby of Christie's 20 minutes before the auction began, in a good coat with her hair done, and when Caroline turned around and saw her standing there, neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Denise said she needed to be there. She needed to see it come back. Caroline put her arm through her cousin's clothes, and they walked into the auction room together and sat side by side, and when the gavel came down at $9 million, Denise grabbed Caroline's hand and held it so tightly that Caroline could feel her pulse. Afterward, standing on the sidewalk in the March wind, Denise said she wished her father had been a different person. Caroline said she did too. They stood there together in the cold for a while, not saying anything else. Because sometimes the truest things have already been said, and what is left is simply the work of standing next to each other in the aftermath. The decision about whether to tell Ruth was the hardest one Caroline made in the entire 23-year journey. Not the loan, not the auction, not the 8 months of research. The hardest thing was sitting across from her 71-year-old mother at her kitchen table in the Bronx and placing the consignment record in front of her and watching Ruth's face move through every emotion in sequence. Grief and recognition, and the specific, exhausted relief of a person who has been carrying an unanswered question for so long that the answer, however painful, feels like being allowed to finally put something down. Ruth looked at the document for a long time. Then she said that Dorothy knew. She knew before she died that something wasn't right. She told her the last week she was alive that she was worried about Leonard. Caroline asked why Dorothy hadn't said something. Ruth folded her hands on the table the way Dorothy used to fold her hands and said, because she loved him. And she thought love was enough to stop a person from doing the thing they were already planning to do. The family gathering that happened the following Thanksgiving was the first one in over 2 decades that did not carry the low-grade electrical charge of the unsaid thing. Leonard's name was spoken openly for the first time. His children, Denise and her brother Marcus Jr., were both present, and the family did something that families rarely manage to do with any real grace. They held the complexity of a man who had done something terrible without reducing him entirely to that terrible thing. The table that year was fuller than it had been in years. Patricia, who had not attended a family Thanksgiving since 2009 over an unrelated disagreement, had driven up from Philadelphia. Gerald Jr., the youngest of Dorothy's children, had flown in from Houston with his wife and 2 teenage sons, who had never met most of their extended family, and who sat quietly at the end of the table, absorbing a history that no one had ever thought to tell them before. Raymond, the eldest, gave an informal speech after dinner that no one had asked him to give and that no one interrupted. He was 78 years old, and he spoke the way very old men speak when they have finally decided that the time for careful language has passed. He talked about Leonard as a young man before the debts and the desperation. He talked about Leonard teaching him to fish at a creek outside their childhood town when Raymond was 6 and Leonard was 4, and Leonard had caught 3 fish to Raymond's none and had been insufferably proud about it for the rest of the summer. He talked about Leonard's laugh, which had been, by all accounts, one of the great laughs of the Merritt family. Enormous and unguarded and capable of filling a room with something that felt like permission to be joyful. And then he talked about what Leonard had done with the same directness and without flinching. He said Leonard had been desperate and frightened and had made a choice that cost this family more than he could ever have understood in that moment. He said he had been angry about it for 22 years. He said he was still angry about it. And he said Leonard had also been his brother, and he had loved him, and both of those things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. Nobody argued with that. Denise, sitting across the table, had looked at Raymond for a long moment, and then nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have been given something they did not know they needed. Sometimes the wisest thing that can be said is simply the thing that is true. The question of where the necklace had originally come from was one that Caroline had been circling for months before the auction. The jewelry historian she had commissioned had dated the piece to between 1945 and 1955. The sapphire was Ceylon. The overall craftsmanship was consistent with a skilled independent jeweler rather than a major house, which suggested it had been made to commission. Someone had designed it specifically. Someone had paid for it to be made. And then, at some point in the early to mid-1950s, it had come to Dorothy Merritt, a young black woman in rural Mississippi who would have been in her mid-20s at the time. The answer came 3 months after the auction. In a letter forwarded through the documentary filmmaker, Caroline had initially declined, but who had maintained a respectful distance. The letter was from an 89-year-old woman named Harriet Caldwell, who lived in a care facility in Birmingham, Alabama. Harriet had seen the coverage of the auction and had recognized the necklace from a photograph. She wrote in a careful, slightly shaking hand that she had known Dorothy Merritt in the early 1950s, when they had both worked at the same household in Birmingham, Dorothy as a cook and Harriet as a housemaid. She wrote that the necklace had been given to Dorothy by the woman of the house, a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Foss, who had no children, and who had developed over the years a profound and genuine affection for Dorothy that went far beyond the professional. Mrs. Foss had given Dorothy the necklace in 1953, 2 years before Dorothy left Birmingham to marry James Merritt and move to Mississippi. She had given it to her because she said Dorothy was the finest person she had ever known, and she wanted her to have something that would last. Caroline read that letter sitting on her kitchen floor because she had been standing when she opened it, and her legs had simply declined to keep her upright. Mrs. Eleanor Foss had been dead since 1971, but Harriet Caldwell, at 89, had held that memory for 70 years and had recognized a photograph in a news story and had picked up a pen. Caroline called the care facility and spoke to Harriet for 45 minutes. Harriet remembered Dorothy with the precision of someone for whom certain memories never fade, the way she laughed, the way she moved through a kitchen, the way she had a particular habit of humming old hymns under her breath while she worked. She remembered the day Mrs. Foss gave her the necklace. She said Dorothy had cried. She said Mrs. Foss had cried. She said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen two people do for each other, across every line that their world had drawn between them. Caroline flew to Birmingham the following weekend. She sat with Harriet Caldwell for 3 hours and recorded the conversation with Harriet's full permission. She showed Harriet the necklace through a video call on her phone, and Harriet leaned forward in her chair and touched the screen with one finger the same way Caroline had touched the sapphire as a child at Dorothy's feet. She said that was it. That was exactly it. Before Caroline left the facility, Harriet held her hand and said that Dorothy never forgot Mrs. Foss. She talked about her for years after she left Birmingham. She said some people come into your life, and they show you what the world could be if people would only decide to let it. Caroline drove to the airport with the windows down and did not trust herself to speak for a long time. What Harriet also told Caroline in those 3 hours was something that had never been in any of the coverage, something that had never been part of the family story, because Dorothy had never told it to anyone, or if she had told it to anyone, it had been lost somewhere in the decades between then and now. Mrs. Eleanor Foss had not simply given Dorothy the necklace as a parting gift when Dorothy left Birmingham. She had first offered Dorothy money to stay. She had offered her a formal salary increase, a private room of her own in the house, and a written arrangement that would have secured Dorothy's employment for as long as Mrs. Foss lived. Dorothy had considered the offer for 3 days, and then she had declined it, because James Merritt had asked her to marry him, and she had decided that a life of her own, even a harder and less certain life, was worth more than security in someone else's house. Mrs. Foss had not argued with her. She had respected the decision entirely, and she had given Dorothy the necklace not just as a goodbye, but as a kind of testament, a material acknowledgement that Dorothy's judgment about her own life was correct, and that her future was worth a piece of blue light, worth more than anything Dorothy had ever owned. She had said, according to Harriet, that she wanted Dorothy to have something that would remind her, on the days when the life she had chosen was hard, that she had been chosen in return, that she had been seen, that she was worth exactly what she had decided she was worth. The story reached the internet within 48 hours of the auction. A Christie's staff member had posted a single vague line on social media about an extraordinary bidding moment at that day's sale, and from that single line the threads unraveled outward at the speed that only the internet can manage. By the end of the week, Caroline's name was attached to the story. The comment sections were not cynical. They were not skeptical. They were full of people writing things like, "I needed this today, and this is why I still believe in something." Within 72 hours, it had been covered by outlets on 4 continents. A journalist in Lagos wrote a piece connecting it to broader questions of family patrimony and inheritance across the African diaspora that got shared more than the original English-language stories. A researcher in London who studied inheritance and wealth transfer in Black British families cited it in a lecture at a university. It had stopped being just a story about a necklace very quickly. It had become a container for a conversation that a lot of people had been waiting for an occasion to have. Marcus Webb reached out through Christie's 10 days after the auction with a formal note that was brief and direct. He said he had learned more about the circumstances of her bid through the coverage that had emerged in the days following the sale. He said that had he been aware of the full context beforehand, he would not have contested the bidding in the manner he had. And he said in the final line of the note that he hoped the piece brought her family whatever it was they had been missing. Caroline did not respond for 2 weeks. When she finally did, she wrote 3 sentences. She thanked him for his graciousness. She told him the necklace was home. and she told him that she hoped he found whatever he had been looking for in that room, even if it wasn't the necklace. The documentary went into production in the summer of 2024. Caroline participated fully. She allowed cameras into her Queens apartment, into her mother's kitchen in the Bronx, into the Christie's building, where they retraced the path she had walked on the morning of the auction. She flew with the crew to Mississippi to film the property where Dorothy had grown up, a small wood frame house that still stood on a dirt road outside of a town most people had never heard of, now occupied by strangers who allowed them to film the exterior with a generosity that moved everyone on the set. The current occupant, a woman named Mrs. Washington who had lived there for 30 years, had made them lunch and sat on the porch and listened to Caroline talk about Dorothy, and had said at the end of it that she had always felt like that house had been loved. Now she knew why. The Birmingham segment of the documentary had been the one the filmmaker was most uncertain about before they filmed it, and most certain about afterward. They had traveled to the care facility where Harriet Caldwell lived and spent an afternoon with her that the director later described as the most affecting experience of his professional life. Harriet was 90 years old by the time they filmed, small and precise in her movements, with a memory for the 1950s that was sharper than her memory for last week. She talked about Dorothy with the warmth of someone describing a person who had shaped them. She talked about Mrs. Eleanor Foss with a complexity that resisted easy summary, a white widow in 1950s Alabama, who had employed black women in her household, and who had also, within the constraints of that world, genuinely loved at least one of them, and had found a way to say so that transcended the limitations of what their world permitted. Harriet said Mrs. Foss was not a perfect woman. She was a product of her time like everyone else, but she had a heart that was bigger than her time, and she spent her whole life trying to live up to it. She looked at the camera when she said it, with the directness of someone who has earned the right to say exactly what they mean. Ruth wore the necklace for the documentary interview. She sat in her good chair by the window in her apartment with the afternoon light coming in from the west and the necklace at her throat, and she talked about her mother for 40 minutes without stopping. She talked about the kitchen under the single bulb. She talked about the Easter Sundays. She talked about the empty box and the years of not knowing, and the weight of a grief that had no clean object to attach itself to. And then she talked about the morning Caroline called her from the sidewalk outside Christie's, and her voice changed in the way that voices change when a person arrives, finally, at the thing they have been moving toward for a very long time. She said when she heard her daughter say she was bringing it home, she didn't think about the necklace. She thought about Dorothy. She thought, Dorothy knew. She always knew that child was going to do something the rest of us couldn't. The documentary premiered at a film festival in the spring of 2025, to a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. Caroline sat in the back of the theater, watching the room rather than the screen, reading the faces of strangers encountering her grandmother's life for the first time. Afterward, a woman she had never met came up to her in the lobby and said she had a similar story in her own family. Something taken, something lost, something never recovered. She wanted to know how Caroline had kept going for 23 years without giving up. Caroline thought about it for a moment. Then she said she didn't keep going every day. Some years she stopped completely. She just never stopped permanently. The woman wrote that down on her program. Caroline noticed and did not say anything. Some things don't need a comment. They just need to be heard. On Easter Sunday 2024, almost exactly 23 years after Dorothy Merritt was buried in her good dress without her necklace, Caroline took the subway to the Bronx. She had the necklace in a small velvet pouch in her tote bag, resting against the same leather that had carried her documentation to the Christie's auction 2 weeks earlier. She had not told her mother she was bringing it that day. She had said only that she was coming for dinner. Ruth had made sweet potato pie. The house smelled like brown sugar, and clove the same way it had always smelled on Easter Sunday, and the same way Dorothy's house in Mississippi had smelled on Easter Sunday, for as far back as anyone in the family could remember. Patricia was there. Gerald Jr. had called in from Houston. The table was set with the good dishes that Ruth kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator and only brought out 4 times a year. After dinner, after the plates were cleared, and the conversation had settled into the comfortable quiet of a family that has eaten well together, Caroline reached into her tote bag and placed the velvet pouch on the table in front of her mother without saying anything. Ruth looked at it for a moment, then she looked at her daughter, then she opened it. The necklace came out slowly, the gold chain pooling in her palm, the sapphire catching the light from the window, the way it had always caught light, quietly, completely, without needing to explain itself. Ruth held it for a long time without speaking. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from age but from the specific tremor that belongs to people who are holding something they had stopped believing they would ever hold again. Then she put it on. And Caroline, without planning to, without deciding to, sat down on the floor at her mother's feet, the way she had sat at Dorothy's feet 26 years earlier, and looked up at the blue sapphire in the afternoon light, and did not say anything at all. Ruth put her hand on top of her daughter's head, the way Dorothy used to put her hand on Ruth's head when Ruth was small. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Some things don't need words. Some promises don't need an audience. Some things are simply, finally, home. The loan from Gerald Park's firm was repaid in full by the end of 2024. Caroline had structured the repayment through a combination of a personal financial plan she had built before the auction, proceeds from a licensing agreement with a major media company for the rights to her story, and a consultancy arrangement with the documentary production. She had gone into the auction knowing she would need a path out on the other side, and she had built one before she ever raised her paddle. Gerald Park sent her a handwritten note when the final payment cleared. It said he had financed art for 20 years. He had never financed a story. He was glad he made an exception. Caroline framed it and put it on the wall of her apartment next to a photograph of Dorothy in her Easter dress in 1998. Tamara, who finally heard the full story the night after the auction, and who spent the first 20 minutes of that conversation in stunned silence, and the next 2 hours in tears and laughter in roughly equal measure, came to see the framed note on her next visit, and stood in front of it for a long time. Then she said, in the tone of someone summarizing a thing that cannot really be summarized, "You took the subway to a $9 million auction." Caroline said she had already explained this. Tamara said she knew. She was going to be saying it for the rest of her life. Ruth Merritt turned 72 in November 2025. Her children and grandchildren gathered in her Bronx apartment for a dinner that went on for 5 hours and ended with someone starting to sing one of Dorothy's hymns in the kitchen, and everyone else joining in one by one until the whole apartment was full of it. The necklace was in its oak display case on the shelf by the window. Ruth had not worn it that evening. She had simply wanted it nearby, in the room, present the way a beloved person is present, even when they are not speaking. Caroline had sat beside her mother for most of the evening, talking and laughing and being, in the most ordinary way, exactly where she was supposed to be. At some point late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone, and the kitchen was being cleared, and the apartment was settling back into its normal quiet, Ruth reached over and took Caroline's hand and held it without saying anything. Caroline let her. Outside the window, the Bronx moved through its own indifferent evening, loud and alive and continuous. And in a 14th floor apartment on a street that nobody famous had ever lived on, a family sat together in the ordinary, extraordinary light of having found their way back to each other. Dorothy Merritt's necklace now lives in a custom display case built from Mississippi oak, in a temperature-controlled corner of Ruth Merritt's apartment in the Bronx. It goes on twice a year, on Easter Sunday and on New Year's Eve, exactly as it always did. Ruth wears it the way Dorothy wore it, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of its weight. Caroline comes for both occasions without fail. They do not make speeches. They do not post it on social media. They eat well and they sit together, and sometimes one of them will reach over and touch the sapphire the way you touch something you almost lost, gently, with gratitude, with the specific tenderness of a person who understands that some things only come back once. Some stories do not have a moral. They simply have a truth. And the truth of this one is that the things worth keeping are always worth the cost of keeping them. That a promise made by an 11-year-old girl at a kitchen sink can outlast grief and distance and the passage of 23 years. That love does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly in a wooden box, waiting. Sometimes it takes a subway ride and a borrowed dress and a paddle raised one final time in a room full of people who never saw it coming. That a woman named Eleanor Foss in 1953 Birmingham looked at a young woman named Dorothy Collins and saw not a cook, not an employee, not a person defined by the rigid lines of the world they both lived in, but the finest person she had ever known, and decided that deserved to be said in a way that would outlast both of them. It did. It has. It will. And sometimes, if you are patient enough, and stubborn enough, and willing enough to carry the weight of a thing that matters more than it costs, you get to bring it home. Nobody in that room knew who she was, but now you do, and so does the world. Comment where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. and subscribe so you never miss the next documentary we bring you. Because we have more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things quietly and without an audience, and they deserve to be told. And drop a comment below telling us what part of Caroline's story hit you the hardest. Was it the subway ride to a $9 million auction? Was it the photograph of Dorothy on Easter Sunday? Was it Denise appearing in that lobby without warning? Was it the letter from Harriet Caldwell written in a shaking hand 70 years after the memory was made? Was it the moment Ruth put the necklace on for the first time in 23 years and her daughter sat at her feet on the floor? Tell us. We read every single comment, every single one. We will see you in the next one.